I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. Today we'll be covering a real tragedy, and I would like to give a heads up as this case includes murder of children and suicide. I know as this is a true crime podcast for the most part that you tend to join in for the ride no matter what, but as it does contain such sensitive subjects, I will not be offended if it's too much for you and you decide to click off. Feel free to join me on another week. But for now, let's dive into what you should know about Catherine Mary Glover. Catherine was born Catherine Mary Wilson February 1st, 1864 to her parents Alexander Crawford Wilson and Margaret Smith in Outlands, Tasmania. There really isn't anything listed about her life before what happened in 1898. The only point I could find regarding her life prior was her marriage to George Glover, a special constable and watch housekeeper in Triabunna in 1879. During their marriage, Catherine and George had 8 children over a 13-year period. They had 6 girls: Margaret, Catherine Ethel, also known as Etty, Louisa, Elise, Agnes, and Ida, and 2 sons, Thomas and James. In 1898, her 2 eldest daughters, Margaret and Etty, were in service. From what I could find, it either meant they started to work in a live-in setting, so like a housekeeper or a nanny, or they were being taken care of outside of the household, which I can understand. 8 children is a lot of children to have. As for George, his work meant that he was away from home a lot, similar to how these days you have fly-in, fly-out work, and Catherine would send him letters. In the lead-up, Catherine had sent him a letter telling him to take no notice of anything he heard. She had had trouble and would tell him about it when he came home. Then, referring to a new jacket, she had said that she would never wear it, but that it would do for his next wife. This would have been a huge red flag. However, Catherine had been described in the newspapers following the tragedy as a dreamy, taciturn kind of woman, subject to fits of depression, but no one ever suspected she was disposed to any form of insanity. God, those galahs are loud. I wonder if it could be heard. Now, if you are uncertain what that means, you wouldn't necessarily be the only one. I had to look up the definition of taciturn, which just in short means that she was quiet and reserved. So if we look at her disposition in a modern setting, Catherine seemed to just suffer from depression. Nowhere states that she was being medicated for this, and looking into the history of depression treatment, I would not have been surprised if this made things worse. In 1895, so only 3 years prior to the tragedy, psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin had been the first to distinguish the difference between depression and schizophrenia, as people believed that Catherine did not have a disposition for insanity, as they called it. She would have, at best, been told to talk with a friend, go for walks, listen to music, and make sure she had a good diet. Which, from a modern perspective, I find that quite uninspiring. But that kind of treatment was not, and is still not, adequate for people suffering from anything more than perhaps mild seasonal depression. However, her options would have been more grim, as a popular option for people suffering depression during the late 1800s was a lobotomy. These were often unsuccessful and would cause personality changes, the inability to make decisions, and poor judgment. The heavier end of the scale would result either in a coma or death. As I was researching this, rumours came up stating that Catherine had been struggling with the fear that her and her family were going to become homeless. But I could not find anything to cement a reason for this concern, nor was I able to find what trouble Catherine had been in that she would only discuss with her husband once he returned. With as little information as we have on this one, we can only go with the assumption that Catherine had been struggling mentally. On Tuesday the 1st of March, 1898, Catherine made several calls in Triabunna. At 2 stores, she asked to be supplied with laudanum, but neither had any stock. For those wondering, because I know I was, laudanum was an over-the-counter painkiller at the time. But to be specific, and because it was the 1800s, it was 10% opium powder and contained several opium alkaloids such as morphine and codeine, which was dissolved in alcohol. The shopkeepers who took these calls stated she did not show anything unusual in her demeanour. Catherine also called Cooloy's Hotel and had a conversation with the landlady about accommodating her daughter there, while the family were moving houses. However, arrangements were not made at the hotel, but she did manage to come to an arrangement with a Mrs. Pick that her daughter should stay with her until they were settled in the new house. On Tuesday, this daughter went to the old house to move her stuff to Mrs. Pick's house, but grew concerned when she realised her mother and the younger children were missing. She raised the alarm by reporting this to her father, who then reported this to the police. Superintendent Griffiths made a house-to-house visit, as in he went through the entire town and invited men to join him in the search party. Every man in the place volunteered. The warden, Mr. Mace, actively engaged in the search, and business everywhere was suspended until the mystery of Catherine's disappearance with her children could be resolved. The party worked until midnight and resumed again in the morning of Wednesday. That day, Mr. Ford, a storekeeper at Triabunna, with the assistance of a spaniel, found the dead bodies of 6 children lying in a paddock covered with a blanket and a shawl. The throats of all children were cut. The dead body of Catherine was found in Spring Bay, about a mile from Triabunna, by Mr. Patrick Cusack, the driver of a coach between Triabunna and Campania. Her body was face down in a body of water. Now, there have been conflicting reports saying the water was either 8 inches or 2 feet. I've not been able to find anything that consistently states this. There were 2 shallow cuts and a deeper cut on her own throat. The suspected murder weapon, which was a razor, was found about 4 yards from her body. But ultimately, her death was ruled a suicide by drowning. This altogether paints a very grim picture of a murder-suicide. The children that were murdered ranged from the age of 4 to 11, the only survivors being the 2 eldest daughters and husband who were not present at the time. Also, to give you an idea of what the newspapers were like at the time of reporting, I will quote the article that was released on March 4th, 1898. After an inquest held yesterday on the bodies of the children of the unfortunate woman Glover, the jury returned a verdict to the effect that they met their death at the hands of their mother, who was insane. Take a moment to let that whole statement sink in. I'll wait. Okay, so that statement is both accurate, but so wrong at the same time, and it actually hurts me a little. But those are the immortalized words of the time. So let's try not to get too hung up on them. It is about here where a lot came to light and some bizarre reindeer games were being played by those involved. The husband, George, said that she had talked in a peculiar manner for a while to the lead-up, referring to 2 residents, had said that her blood would rest on their heads. Unfortunately, aside from this being stated in archived newspaper articles, there is no specific information that tells us who she was speaking about. I do, however, feel the conclusion is easily drawn by the next accusation from George. He directly charged Superintendent Griffiths and Warden Mace with causing the tragedy by forcing Catherine to sign paper apologizing for certain statements she had made. I really do wish there was more information on this, as there has been no information clarifying what statements she had to apologize for. But if we are honest with ourselves, being forced to apologize is not a great feeling, and if you are already suffering with psychological difficulties including depression, it would have been very difficult to cope with. I can only imagine having as many children as she had and then having to move house at the same time would have really impacted on that. The superintendent announced his intention to demand full inquiries into this, which would have been a great show for concern of policy and consequences if it wasn't the same man being accused. To quote the short article that followed the inquiry on April 4th, 1898, the Spring Bay Municipal Council held an inquiry with open doors on Saturday with regard to the Glover family tragedy at Triabunna. In offer to sift through certain allegations, made by the husband of the deceased woman against C. Griffiths, the District Superintendent of Police. George Glover, the husband of the deceased, who had murdered 6 of their children and afterwards committed suicide, was not in attendance. Though notified of this intended inquiry, Superintendent Griffiths' statement directly contradicted the statements made by Glover on the alleged authority of his wife, and Superintendent Griffiths was fully exonerated from blame. A resolution expressing continued confidence in him was made. For starters, that has so many run-on sentences and it is actually quite difficult to read aloud. But, understandably, George was trying to have as much resolved from this as possible. He also brought up that certain storekeepers were not called in to state whether they had sold Lordman to Catherine. The storekeeper, named Alice Ford, came forward and admitted to having refused to sell Lordman to Catherine due to her acting strangely. While it was not openly reported what was strange about her behaviour, it was widely reported that Alice assumed Catherine had found somewhere that would sell to her, which she then drugged the children before murdering them, and thought that she perhaps took some of it herself. This had led to 2 of the bodies of the children and Catherine being exhumed for further investigation. However, tests came back with nothing different that had been originally reported, stating that no one had been poisoned. An article from March 9, 1898 has the only other interesting piece to this puzzle. The wording is, "A witness declared the cause of the deceased's death was a paper which Superintendent Griffiths had asked her to sign. She knew she was signing an untruth. She had further stated that the superintendent attempted to take liberties with her. The jury returned the verdict that the deceased met her death by suffocation in shallow water." So we can comfortably assume that Catherine did in fact drown. Water was very likely found in her lungs. However, the article does not name the witness, and appears to link back to the apology that she allegedly was forced to sign by the superintendent. But what does the rest mean? Considering the time gap between when this occurred and now, we can only assume what it means for someone to try to take liberties with someone else. As time has gone by, words do tend to change meaning. So taking liberties with someone can mean very different things. So either he was trying to embellish on something that had occurred, or he had been far too familiar with her, or potentially even tried to get her to stray from her husband. However, I will admit I am unsure of the meaning specifically for this, as it doesn't go into any more detail than just that singular statement. Officially, this case was closed as a murder-suicide, where 34-year-old Catherine Glover took the lives of 6 of her children, as well as her own life. But I do wonder, with that final witness statement and the accusations from George, was this really the case? Or was there potentially something more sinister at play from the hands of Superintendent Griffiths? Due to the time that this case happened in, it is very likely that we will never actually know or understand what actually happened, as so much time has passed with it. But that is all I really have for this case. It was quite a short one. There's not a lot of information, as the 1800s was quite a long time ago. But if you have any theories or you have any other information, please feel free to reach out and let me know. I would love to hear from the perspective of anyone else. And you can reach out to me with these either at my email, which is whatyoushouldknowaustralia@gmail.com, or on Instagram, where I will post photos of what I can for this case, at whatyoushouldknowaustralia. So until next time, stay safe and stay hydrated.